Carrying on the theme this weekend, consciousness, from beginning to end of life and beyond. Today, we will hear from speakers who will take us on an incredible journey that will intersect the mind, spirit, and body, helping us to peer closely into the molecular level while widening our view at the conscious level. Our speakers today come from many areas in the healthcare field, will present their knowledge, experience, and scientific research to show that spirituality and medicine are not mutually exclusive, but that the exploration and integration of both can bring about a greater understanding and effectively benefit each of us in achieving a physical, mental, and spiritual balance. Enjoy your time here. Thank you.
Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Mario Beauregard. Dr. Beauregard is a cognitive neuroscientist currently affiliated with the Department of Psychology, University of Arizona. He received his PhD in neuroscience and was an associate researcher at the University of Montreal. He has been studying the neuroscience of consciousness and mystical experience for many years, including a study investigating the brain activity of Carmelite nuns. He is the author of more than 100 publications, including 2 books, The Spiritual Brain, A Neuroscientist's Case for the Existence of the Soul, co-authored with Denise O'Leary and Brain Wars. In 2013, he participated in a dialogue with the Dalai Lama in regard to the science of mind. Please welcome Dr. Mario Beauregard.
Thank you for the introduction, and I would like to thank also Dr. Sonia Doi for having invited me to participate in this very stimulating Congress. So today I'm going to talk about what I call the primordial psyche, which is the idea that the psyche, including mind, consciousness, is a fundamental force, as basic as the fundamental forces of physics, if you will. So in terms of the outline of the presentation, I'm going to start with to talk a bit about what has been called the modern scientific worldview. And then I'm going to present brain imaging studies showing the impact of the psyche upon brain activity. I'm also going to introduce the concept of the extended psyche, or non-local psyche. Some presenters have talked about it yesterday. And then I'll present briefly a new theory that I have proposed recently called the theory of psych-elementarity. And finally, I will present briefly the emerging post-materialist paradigm. And most of what I'm going to talk about can be found in my 2 previous books, The Spiritual Brain and also Brain Wars. I'm going to use mind, consciousness, and psyche throughout my presentation. When I use mind, I'm referring to mental processes and events and functions. By consciousness, I mean subjective experience mainly, and awareness. And finally, for me, psyche include all the mental processes, whether they are conscious or non-conscious. And this includes the self and consciousness as well. So let's start with the modern scientific worldview. It's a worldview that is based on a number of what we could call metaphysical assumptions. So these assumptions are hypotheses regarding the nature of reality. And during the 19th century, these hypotheses, these assumptions, they narrowed and they turned into dogma. And they constituted an ideological belief system that came to be known as scientific materialism. So it's composed of a number of assumptions, several assumptions. I'm presenting here a few of them. the most important is materialism. So this is the idea that everything in the universe can be ultimately explained in terms of collections of material particles and fields. And for materialism, the universe is a cold, impersonal machine. It's devoid of goals or meaning. Another assumption is reductionism. So it's the idea that complex systems, for instance, a brain, can be explained by the sum of their parts. And a related concept is upward causation. So it means that causation only flows upward from the simpler to the more complex. So applied to the brain, it would mean that you can explain what's going on in the brain by looking at, for instance, chemical messengers, looking at biophysical processes in the brain, and so on and so forth. Another assumption associated with this ideology is determinism. So it's the idea that all events are caused by events that happened before them. So these assumptions have several implications regarding the relationship between the brain and the psyche. It means, for instance, that everything that we experience, our thoughts, our emotions, our beliefs, our intentions, even our spiritual insights, well, all of this is identical or can be reduced to electrical and chemical processes in the brain. And it also entails that the psyche is powerless, it's impotent. So it means that our thoughts, our intentions, our beliefs do not have any effect upon our brains and our bodies and also the physical world. And it also implies that our psyche is biologically encapsulated. So it means that it cannot exert any effect outside the confines of the brain and the body. So this ideology, it became very dominant in the academic world during the 19th and the 20th century. And the dominance of this ideology has very negatively affected the development of consciousness research, the mind science, and also the scientific study of spirituality. And faith in this ideology has compelled several scientists to neglect the subjective dimension of the human experience and also to downplay the importance of the psyche. So materialist theories claims that psyche does not have any effect over brain activity. But I'm going to present a series of brain imaging studies showing that this is not the case at all. Well, first of all, we know that there's a lot of psychology studies showing that thoughts, and for instance, or beliefs, they can greatly affect behavior through intentions that are translated into plans, for instance. And social psychological studies shows that the explanatory and predictive value of what they call agentic factors, for instance, beliefs, desires, intention, this is very high, this predictive and explanatory value. And these studies taken together, they mean that human beings are conscious, intentional beings. So in other words, we are creative and proactive agents of experience. We're not simply undergoers of experiences. And if this is the case, then it means that we can greatly affect what's going on in our brains. So here's a slide illustrating a brain imaging study that we've done some years ago. And it was the first study that was done, the first brain imaging study. We used functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. It was the first study about emotion regulation, which is the capacity for us to influence or self-regulate the emotions that we feel and how we express these emotions. And the paradigm was very simple. We scanned a group of 10 university students, all men, and we asked them simply to watch very emotionally laden movies. In this case, it was hardcore erotic films. And as expected, we saw very strong, robust activation in regions of the brain that are part of what we call the limbic system, or the emotional brain. So we saw activations in the hypothalamus, for instance, and the amygdala, the anterior temporal pole, and so on and so forth. And this was expected. In what we call the inhibition condition, we ask our subjects to become detached observers of their own physiological arousal and also of the film clips themselves. And this strategy, this cognitive strategy, is very similar to what is called in meditation, Buddhist meditation, mindfulness. And these people, these subjects, didn't have any experience in terms of meditation, mindfulness, for instance. But remarkably, when we showed them very similar film excerpts in the inhibition condition, all the activation in the regions of the brain that were associated with the limbic system, the emotional brain, these activations, they were all gone. And this was very remarkable because these people didn't have any training. We did another study using another brain imaging technology called positron emission tomography. And this time we measured the production of a chemical messenger that is called serotonin in the brain. It's a chemical messenger that is involved in a variety of functions, but it's the key chemical messenger implicated in mood regulation. So in the case of that study, we asked our subjects to remember and reenact internally the happiest episode of their lives. And we were measuring the activity of serotonin after about 10 minutes, after they started to self-induce the emotional state. And so after our subjects did that, we saw an increase in terms of the production of serotonin in several brain regions that are key components of the emotional brain, the limbic system. We did also the reverse, exactly the reverse. We asked our subjects to remember and reenact the saddest episode of their lives. And we gave them about 10 minutes to do that. And they had already practiced before doing the actual experiment. They had practiced for about a week at home. And we saw exactly the reverse finding. So there was a decrease in terms of the production of serotonin in the same brain regions. We did also studies with people suffering from specific phobia. So one of these studies was with a group of women, 12 women, suffering from spider phobia, and very severe spider phobia. So at the beginning of our experiment, these women were not even able to touch pictures of spiders in a booklet. So they were very phobic. And what we did is that they were lying down inside a scanner, the fMRI scanner, and we presented them with film clips of spiders in motion. So they all experienced a very severe panic reaction, as you can understand, when we first scanned them. And we were seeing activation in regions of the brain like the amygdala, the hippocampus, regions associated with emotion reactivity. These women underwent a treatment with 2 psychotherapists that lasted for a month. It was divided in 4 different sessions. And it was mainly based on the corrections of their erroneous beliefs about what spiders are, what they can do. Because, for instance, many of these women have had very bad experiences with spiders when they were young. but they were also convinced that spiders were smart enough to be able to devise Machiavellic plans to attack humans and so on and so forth. And so we invited an expert from the Insectarium of Montreal, an expert about spiders, to tell them that this was not possible and to teach them about the limited perceptual capacities of spiders and so on and so forth. And so after 4 weeks of treatment, all of our patients were able to hold in their hands giant tarantulas. So we scanned them again, showing the same type of films, but this time the activation in the limbic portion of the brain, the emotional brain, was totally gone. So what we observed fit very well with what they were now experiencing from a subjective perspective. Another interesting phenomenon that can greatly affect brain activity, it's the placebo effect. And the placebo effect is based on essentially on the belief in the efficacy of a fake treatment. So it can be distilled water, it can be a sugar pill, it can be also surgery. So for instance, at the end of the 90s at the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas, there was a very interesting study done about sham surgery. And so they did an arthroscopy for the osteoarthritis of the knee. But the placebo intervention consisted of a very small incision. But the patients belonging to the placebo group didn't know that they were receiving only a small incision. And most of these people, before the intervention, they had to walk with a cane. But after the intervention, several of them were even able to play basketball. So this was very impressive. This is another PET study done with positron emission tomography. And in this study, a group of researchers at the University of British Columbia in Canada, they investigated the response to a placebo in patients suffering from a very severe form of Parkinson's disease. In Parkinson's disease, there's a destruction of the nerve cells, the neurons producing another chemical messenger that is called dopamine. It's involved in all sorts of functions, but it's the main chemical messenger regarding motor activity. And so in the case of these patients, the patients who most believed in the placebo, they started to produce amounts of dopamine comparable to what you see in young, healthy people. And they were also at the same time experiencing a remission in terms of their symptoms. So they had much less rigidity, much less tremors, for instance. And this effect lasted for a certain period of time. But this was very impressive. So here, a smaller volume of the red color means an increased level of dopamine production. So we can greatly influence what's happening in our brain, the activity of our brain. And this concept is related to what we call neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is the idea that the adult human brain is always changing its function and its structure by creating new neurons, new synaptic contacts, new neural circuits also. And so it's possible to train our minds volitionally through meditative practice, for instance. And in doing so, we can enhance the activity of the brain areas that are implicated in various functions, including emotion regulation, compassion, and attention. Here is an example of an fMRI study we've done with a group of experienced meditators versus beginners. And you can see that when you present very emotionally laden pictures, this is a picture that part of a database that is called the International Affective Picture System. It's used by psychologists to study emotions. Well, in the beginners, you can see, as expected, a strong response from the amygdala, for instance, which is involved in the evaluation of the meaning of the information, the emotional meaning. But in the case of the experienced meditators, and these people had meditated for about 3-4 years, you don't see any reaction, even when you present an image as intense as this one. So the brain, when you meditate, the brain is really changing a lot. And there are many ways to change the brain. So meditation is one avenue, but you have also neurofeedback. And so through neurofeedback, you can learn to control the electrical activity of your brain. So you have electrodes, for instance, that are measuring electrical activity. And when you want to reach a certain type of a target, for instance, a type of electrical activity, it can be that you want to increase certain types of electrical waves or not. You can slow them down. If you're in the zone, then there's a video game that will be activated. It responds. When you go outside of the zone, you're not in the target zone, everything stops. The video game stops, and there's no music, no musical feedback anymore. So you have to be able to activate yourself, the video game, controlling your own brain activity. And when you do that, you also change the brain, not only its function, but its structure. So we did a study in my lab a few years ago, and you can see here that after only a few months of training, and this training was targeting attention specifically, sustained attention. It was done in university students. You will increase the amount of gray matter and the volume of gray matter in regions of the brain that are associated with attention. You can also target emotion regions, if you will. The psyche can greatly influence what's happening in the brain, as we just saw, but it can also affect other physiological systems that are connected to the brain, systems like the immune system, the endocrine system. And so this is what is investigated by psychoneuroimmunology. We've heard about this yesterday. And this is also the idea for the psychosomatic network that was proposed by Candace Pert. And so Candace Pert and the work she's done and other researchers in the PNI field, they have demonstrated that all these physiological systems constantly communicate through chemical messengers, which can be considered as informational substances. And many studies have shown that relaxation, meditation, positive emotions, also mental imagery, can bolster the functioning of the immune system. And now we can also include in this concept of a psychosomatic network gene expression, because there's increasing evidence showing that we can turn genes on or off depending on what we're entertaining at the mind level. So we're much more powerful than we thought previously. So I've talked about the influence of the psyche on the brain and the body, but psyche can also exert what we could call a non-local effect or an extended effect. So it's the idea that the brain is not, or the psyche, pardon me, is not limited to specific points in space, for instance, the brain and the body. It's not also limited to specific points in time, for instance, the present. So psi phenomena provide support for this existence of the non-local psyche. And to evaluate the magnitude of these phenomena, researchers use what has been called meta-analysis. So these meta-analysis are statistical analysis that allow researchers to combine several small-scale experiments to estimate the true magnitude of a given phenomenon. Skeptics regarding psi phenomena have raised the the so-called file drawer problem. So this is it refers to the hypothetical studies that have been done by scientists, but that have not been published because they produced negative results. So it's possible using meta-analysis to calculate how many file drawer studies there would have to be to nullify, to cancel the positive results that have been published. So if we take the case of telepathy, for instance, which is the mental exchange of information, many experiments regarding telepathy have been conducted during the last decades using a Ganzfeld protocol. So the Ganzfeld is a sensory deprivation technique that evokes a pleasant, dreamy state of awareness. And these experiments involve typically two participants. So you have one person who concentrates on mentally transmitting an image, and these images can be taken from motion pictures or cartoons or TV shows. So it's the sender, and you have the other participant, the receiver. So meta-analysis have been performed to evaluate the magnitude of this phenomenon, and one of them was conducted by Psi researcher Dean Radin and his colleagues, and the study showed odds against chance of 29 quintillion to 1. And so, and also Radin and his colleagues evaluated that there would have been over 2,000 studies would have been necessary to invalidate this finding. And given the limited number of Psi researchers around the world, this is not very realistic at all. So we can say that really telepathy does exist. It's been demonstrated empirically. There's also the other kinds of psi phenomena. One of them is the mental interaction with physical systems. So what is used very often in these studies is what we call a random number generator. So basically it's an electronic circuit that produces thousands of random coin flips per second. So instead of using heads and tails, this apparatus produces sequences of random bits, so either zeros or ones, and it does that thousands of times per second. So in these studies, the participants are asked to mentally influence the output of this device so that it produces either more zeros than ones or vice versa. And it's a very small device that you can see over there that is connected to a laptop. So there was a very important program that was carried at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, or PAIR Lab. It was Robert Jan who supervised this program for a number of years, and they reviewed 12 years of experiment, and this included over 800 experiments, over also 100 participants. And in these studies, the participants were asked to try to intentionally influence the output of the random number generators, either above the chance expected average, like here, or below. So above was called the high aim condition, and below was the low aim condition. And this is the baseline. This is what is expected through only random processes. And the results of the meta-analysis produce odds against chance of 35 trillion to 1. Very impressive again. Psi researchers, they've also shown that it's possible to mentally interact with living systems, not only physical systems. So the targets can be humans, other humans, and the electrodermal response, which is an index of emotional reactivity, has been used a lot in these studies. But enzyme activity has also been investigated in vitro, or hemolysis, which is the breakage of the red blood cells membrane, in vitro also. And the impact on the growth rate of plants has also been researched. And a meta-analysis of 37 of these experiments was conducted by William Broad and Marilyn Schlitz when they were working at the Mind Science Foundation in Texas. And so they performed a meta-analysis of 37 of these experiments. And in 15 of these experiments, the sender and the receiver were isolated by a distance because it works also at a distance. And the odds against chance were more than 100 trillion to 1. So another type of empirical phenomenon that is supportive of this notion of an extended psyche or a non-local psyche is the near-death experience. So near-death experiences are vivid mental experiences that happen close to death or during clinical death. Sometimes they are not happening close to death. It's possible, but it does not happen very often. And this experience is characterized by an enhancement of mental activity, for instance, perception, thinking, emotions, memory. So the experiencers retain all these functions and also a sense of personal identity. And the activity itself, the mental activity, is enhanced compared to normal waking state. And these experiences can be triggered by electrocution or complications from anesthesia or surgery, cardiac arrest also, or severe blood loss. So some studies have estimated that more than 25 million individuals worldwide have had such an experience during the past 50 years. And studies have shown that this is an experience which is not influenced by age, gender, race, religious affiliation, level of education, or socioeconomic status. So it's very much universal. And the core features of these experiences are first the out-of-body experience. And importantly, the OBE is the only aspect of the NDE that can be independently corroborated. You also have feelings of peace and joy. The experiencers report often a passage through a tunnel or a region of darkness. There's also an encounter with deceased relatives and friends, and often also an encounter with a being of light that radiates complete acceptance and also unconditional love. From a neuroscientific point of view, the NDEs that are triggered by a cardiac arrest are very interesting because during cardiac arrest, the blood flow is interrupted, blood flow to the brain. And if you're measuring the electrical activity of the brain using an electroencephalogram or EEG, you will see that the electrical activity will disappear after 10 to 20 seconds usually. And also the brainstem reflexes disappear. And the brainstem is the region of the brain involved in the regulation of breathing and heart function. So the cortical regions that are supposed to produce mental functions in this state of cardiac arrest, they are no longer active. Yet, during the last 13 years, 4 different studies have been conducted in the UK, in the United States, also in the Netherlands, and they have reported hundreds of patients who have experienced conscious mental activity, NDEs, during cardiac arrest. So one aspect which is very interesting also is the veridical out-of-body experience. The out-of-body experience is the sense of having left one's body and watching events going on around one's body. And sometimes it's done at a distant physical location. So the veridical OBEs are those that can be independently corroborated, that is proven to coincide with reality. Nearly half of the near-death experiencers report an out-of-body experience. And the NDE cases involving veridical OBE perception greatly outweigh those involving inaccurate perception. It's above 90%. So some cases of veridical OBE perception happens during cardiac arrest. And so, for instance, there was a case reported by Pim van Lommel in his Lancet paper, case of a man who arrived at a coronary care unit and in a state of cardiac arrest. And the nurse removed the dentures to intubate the patient, and the dentures were put onto a cart. And after about 90 minutes, well, the patient was resuscitated, and after 90 minutes, he was still ventilated, he was intubated, and he was still comatose. But after a week, he was back on the cardiac ward, and so he saw the nurse, and he told the nurse that he was recognizing this person. He said, "You were there when I was brought into hospital, and you took my dentures out of my mouth and put them onto that cart." And he wanted his dentures back. So he asked the nurse, and he was able to describe very correctly, in detail, what had happened during the resuscitation procedure, also the appearances of the nurses and the doctors who were present. Yeah, but this is only one case like this, but there are others, several others. So what are the implications? Well, these phenomena, they pose a major problem for materialist theories of psyche, because these materialist theories cannot explain something like this. But the proponents of these theories, they argue that even though the EEG is isoelectric, it means that it's completely flatline, there may be some residual brain activity that cannot be detected because of the limitations of the EEG technology that we're using. And this is true, this is possible, because we measure only the activity of large population of cortical neurons. But the crucial issue here is not whether there may be some residual activity, but rather that the form of electrical activity that is required for conscious mental activity in the brain, it's very well detected with the current EEG technology. And we know that in these patients, this form of electrical activity is totally abolished. So all these empirical evidence that I've presented to you have led me to propose a theory that I call psych-elementarity. And it was recently published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. And there are 4 postulates in this theory. First one is that psyche is primordial and irreducible. So what I'm saying is that the psyche is as primordial as matter, energy, information, and space-time. So it means that if psyche is not there, there's no universe. You don't experience anything. You cannot experience anything. Nothing exists. If you don't have consciousness, for instance, which is one of the crucial aspects of the psyche, you cannot have any subjective experience regarding what we call the physical world, and also regarding what's going on internally, mentally, your internal world. So in my view, it's not possible to reach a correct understanding of the world, of nature, at microphysical level, and also at more macro levels, behaviorally, for instance, if we do not integrate psyche into our conceptual frame of reference. Also, psyche is a fundamental force of nature, as fundamental as the forces of physics. Why? It's a force because it has the capacity to cause change. This is the definition, the physical definition of a force. And it is fundamental because it allows us to account for a plethora of natural phenomena at various levels of organization. It's also the means through which we constantly create and transform our world. But it's like gravity, for instance, or dark energy. So you cannot see it, You cannot measure it directly, but you can only infer it, given its consequences. It's a fundamental force, as we've seen, because mental processes and events, for instance, our thoughts, our emotions, our beliefs, well, they do exert a causal influence on behavior and on the activity of the brain and the body, as I've shown. And the impact of the psyche also is not limited to the brain and the body, since mental intention can influence at a distance physical processes and living organism. I've proposed what I call the psychoneural transduction mechanism to explain the interface between what's going on mentally and what's going on in terms of brain processes and other physiological processes. So, according to this hypothesis, mental events, whether conscious or not, or can be unconscious, they are specifically encoded by the brain. That is, they are translated through this mechanism into different forms of informations. So it means different types of neural events at various levels of brain organization. So it can be biophysical, can be the molecular level, the chemical level, the level of the neural circuits also. And these resulting neural events, they are translated into other forms of information. That is, events in other physiological systems that are part of the psychosomatic network. And this is a figure illustrating this mechanism. So you see that at the level of the psyche, we have beliefs, we have perceptions, thoughts, memories, desires, and so on and so forth. What I'm claiming is that these mental processes and events are translated chemically and electrically in the brain. So for instance, you can entertain a positive thought or emotion, and it will be translated chemically in your brain and also in your body. For instance, we know that, like one of the studies I've shown, if you entertain for a number of minutes a very positive thought, an happy thought, you will start, you will make the brain producing more serotonin, for instance, in specific regions. If you are entertaining negative thoughts, negative beliefs, and so on and so forth, you will also exert an effect, but the effect will be very different. You're not going to generate the same type of chemical messengers, for instance. And these, if you're stressed out, for instance, you will produce a lot of cortisol. And we know now that if you do that for a certain period of time, for weeks or months or even years, it will become neurotoxic. So it will destroy nerve cells, neurons in various regions of the brain, especially in the regions of the brain involved in memory. Now we know that there's a relationship between negative or depressive thoughts and dementias, like Alzheimer's disease. So it's possible to destroy your own brain by entertaining negative thoughts and emotions in the long run. So now it's becoming obvious. And so the product of this translation are also influencing what's going on in the other physiological systems connected to the brain, like the immune system, the endocrine system, the autonomic nervous system, but also at the gene expression level. There's increasing evidence showing this. So the third postulate of this theory is that psyche and the physical world are deeply interconnected. So psyche and physis, the Greek word for the physical world, they interact because they are not radically separated. They only appear to be separated. But it is an illusion. So they are deeply interconnected. Why? Because they are complementary aspects or manifestations of an undividable whole that we call reality. I'm not the first one to propose that. It's been proposed by physicists Wolfgang Pauli, Carl Gustav Jung, and also another famous physicist, David Bohm. And it is this undividable wholeness which in my view renders the psyche capable of influencing physical and biological phenomena. And this interconnectedness between psyche and physics, it does not appear to rest on quantum entanglement, as some has suggested, because non-local connections between entangled particles, they do not involve any transfer of information, whereas interaction at a distance, for instance, between humans or between humans and physical systems or living systems does. So this is a big difference. And also, this type of interaction implicates mental phenomena. For instance, beliefs, emotions, attention. Now, quantum physics doesn't have anything to say about these mental phenomena. The final postulate of this theory is that the psyche is not produced by the brain. So normally, mental processes and events, they are closely associated with neuroelectrical and neurochemical activity. So there's a variation, concomitant variation between the states of the psyche and the states of the brain. But mental phenomena, they're non-physical. They do not have any, a thought, for instance, does not have any shape, mass, volume. So it's not localized in the brain and the body. And it cannot be reduced to physical and chemical phenomena, especially given the fact that the psyche can exert effects at a distance, telesomatic effects. And also, the enhanced mental experiences and the accurate out-of-body perception occurring during a cardiac arrest, they also strongly suggest that psyche is not produced by the brain. So what is the brain? In my view, it is an interface and a filter. So it acts as an interface or a relay station for the psyche, and also as a filter. And it normally restricts the access to expanded forms of consciousness. And again, this is not a new idea. It's been proposed a long time ago by William James and philosophers Ferdinand Schiller in Great Britain, and also Henri Bergson, the French philosopher. To understand what the brain does, we can use the TV analogy. So a TV received broadcast signals, electromagnetic fields, basically, and it converts these signals into images and sounds. And if we damage the electronic components of the TV, we're going to induce a distortion of the image and the sound, because the capacity of the TV set to receive and to decode the broadcast signal is impaired. But that doesn't mean that the broadcast signals and the program are produced by the TV. So we can use the same analogy regarding the relationship between the psyche and the brain. And so this means that normally the brain allows us to experience only a narrow portion of reality. In other words, it limits our experience of other realms that may be non-physical. But the good news is that this filter function of the brain can be altered in many different ways. For instance, through spiritual practices, meditation, sensory deprivation, psychedelics, NDEs, of course, especially during cardiac arrest, when the filter function of the brain is totally inactivated. And so altogether, all the empirical evidence that I've shown to you, that I've presented today, leads to what I call an emerging post-materialist paradigm. And these evidence clearly shows that scientific materialism is incomplete and, I believe, obsolete now. I didn't have the time to talk about other lines of evidence supporting a post-materialist view, like the work done with research mediums, for instance, the research on reincarnation, and also on transcendent experiences, for instance. But, people interested can consult very good books about that and papers, and other presenters are talking about these things. But so what I'm saying is now it's time to enlarge our concept of the natural world and to embrace a post-materialist perspective. And this emerging post-materialist paradigm acknowledges the reality of matter, and it celebrates the progress made by materialist-focused science over the past century. It also posed the existence of, as Gary said yesterday, a greater reality, which includes matter, energy, and information. It recognized the fundamental role of mind and consciousness, and also spirit, in nature and in the cosmos. And for those interested, a copy of a document that is called the Manifesto for a Post-Materialist Science has been distributed. It's in your packet that you received yesterday. And so if you want to learn more a bit about this emerging post-materialist paradigm, you can consult this document that was written with Gary and other colleagues like Rupert Sheldrake, Larry Dossey, and so on, Charles Tart also, Marilyn Schlitz. And so I believe that the new science about mind, consciousness, and spirit, that the new science, the new empirical evidence or findings that do not fit within the old materialist framework will eventually lead us to a new scientific revolution, and it will probably be the greatest conceptual revolution that we will have ever experienced in our entire history. So the shift from materialist science to post-materialist science will be of vital importance to the evolution of the human civilization. I thank you for your attention.